Hello and welcome to another Tippling Philosopher video where I am incarcerated. No, I'm not. I'm being well treated in a clinic in Moscow for my primary progressive multiple sclerosis. Due to the fact I stare at the same four walls in isolation for what will be up to 10 days, I feel the need to speak to, if no one real, then this laptop camera. So I thought I would do a blog entry or vlog and just have a little chat about something. Today I was going to talk about human rights and the fact that human rights don't really exist. And this might be a little bit controversial for some of you because we talk about inalienable rights all the time and human right to do this, and we have rights here, and refugees have rights, and victims have rights, and all this talk about human rights is really integrated into our language in a way that we seem to intuitively understand. But when you start picking it apart, it's quite problematic, and it really depends where you start with your core philosophy. So when I say that human rights don't exist, I mean they don't have ontic existence, that they do not exist outside of our minds. I, as I often say, am a conceptual nominalist, which means abstract ideas don't exist out there in the ether. There isn't a place where a platonic realm where ideas exist. Ideas exist in our head. They are concepts that exist in our head. And if we all died, if all sentient creatures died, then human rights as an idea would die with them, with us. So this includes all sorts of things like morality and any other sort of abstract construct that we can create and make sense of in our minds. So, like most other humans, I often talk about rights as if they do exist, as if they are objective entities. But I suppose this is lazy language. They, like language itself, are arrived at by consensus. So dictionaries are interesting things. People think they're really prescriptive books, that this is how you should write something. Dictionaries are descriptive. We create words and we use them and we spell them in a particular way, and then after we do that for long enough, someone writes it down in a dictionary and says, okay, that's how we spell it because that's how everyone spells it. And in fact, spellings change over time to reflect this. And when we agree on any word, we merely codify it by putting it in a dictionary or an encyclopedia, for example. So, that I think is a good example that might set us off on this conversation about human rights. We invented the word gamification recently because it had use to us as a concept. So we created that concept, we used it in our language, and dictionaries began to reflect that by codifying it and sort of dictating the spelling, but the spelling is arrived at really by consensus. So it's similar with abstract concepts like human rights. We think and observe and take part in society, and we make moral proclamations. I don't know, something like these sort of generic ones: the right to life, the right to liberty and freedom, the right to the pursuit of happiness, the right to live your life free of discrimination, the right to control what happens to your own body and to make medical decisions for yourself, the right to freely exercise your religion and practice your religious beliefs without fear of being prosecuted for your beliefs, the right to be free from prejudice on the basis of race, gender, national origin, colour, age or sex, the right to grow old, the right to a fair trial and the due process of law, the right to be free from cruel and unusual punishment, the right to be free from torture, slavery, the right to freedom of speech, the right to freely associate with whomever you like and to join groups of which you'd like to be a part, the right to freedom of thought, and the right to be not to be prosecuted from your thoughts or for your thoughts. And you might want to get more specific than those still. I mean, the list is fairly massive, right, of the rights that you can think of. If I thought up these ideas but no one else did, or no one else agreed, no one else, say that list I've just read you, no one else agreed to, they're not really human rights at all in any pragmatic sense, and they certainly aren't universal. They're just my opinion, really. I could argue that there is a set of human rights that exist in some kind of ether or potential realm or truth, perhaps in God. Of course, the Bible contravenes even some of the most basic human rights of, say, the UN, which seems infinitely more sensible and moral in its proclamations. You know, the Charter, Universal Charter of Human Rights, or the UN Charter of Human Rights, appears to be eminently more sensible than those rights espoused in the Bible. But again, it merely comes down to a case of consensus and agreement. My right might not be your right. I might say I think there should be a human right to be able to, I don't know, smash a fridge over someone's head who has blue hair. You know, unless we all agree on that by consensus, it's kind of meaningless and just a personal opinion. But then if we agree on it by consensus, then isn't it just a large subjective opinion anyway? So there was a problem with the observable data of say, the holy books of the world, but let's scrap that book as a source of information for human rights. This whole post is equivalent to my writings on the ontology of morality, I suppose, since human rights are merely moral proclamations, and that's where this is going to go, that they assume, we assume they are objective and that they somehow transcend time and culture, but of course in reality human rights don't, and we develop them over time using philosophy and analysing pragmatically the world around us and seeing that, hey, what that happened in that war or in that situation was really not on and not conducive to a flourishing humanity, and so therefore I don't think we should have the right to do that. So over time in thought and society, people do tend towards agreement on moral matters because we have similar brains and similar cultures. Now there are large amounts of grey areas around here, of course. You could be on the American right now, for example, and be, dead against abortion, or pro-life against pro-choice. And here we have two sets of people who seem to think they have access to human rights, but those human rights are they're at odd ends with each other. So, this is a really problematic notion. I mean, I've discussed this with Connected Ideas in terms of personhood. As a word that describes a set of properties. What is personhood? What does it mean to be human? And of course, people disagree on this. It's one of those classic philosophical quandaries where no one can quite agree on what personhood really is and what the properties are that denote personhood, and whether you can lose them temporarily or forever. And does this invalidate you as being a person? Human rights sound lovely, but until we do something with them, they're effectively meaningless. They need to have ramifications, and this is the step that is important for understanding human rights, in my opinion. Human rights, therefore they are the philosophical underpinnings of moral thoughts that form the foundations of law. So it kind of goes human rights, philosophical thinking and moral thoughts, codify that into law. As we grow into a global society, the term human right takes on a far more transcendent and universal quality that dismisses borders in favour of the human race. It becomes, as I say, a universal term. This is why it's often connected to the UN as an organisation that oversees kind of the whole world to some degree, trying to set out to unite humanity as one to one cause. This international law, it is hoped, somehow trumps the national and parochial laws of individual countries. So you might have a country that says, well, it's our right to do this, genital mutilation, for example. And then you might have an overarching set of international laws and organisations that say, actually, that's not on. And both are doing different forms of philosophy. Some might be more moral relativistic philosophy that is deeply based in parochial culture and history, whilst others are looking far afield and saying, well, actually, let's look at the rights of the people involved, irrespective of the context of where this thing takes place. But until we codify human rights into law, first into local and then national, but more usefully into universal and border transcendent laws, the thinking and the philosophy behind these human rights is kind of ineffectual and pragmatically impotent. It's kind of meaningless for me to sit in this room and say, well, I have a human right to do blah, whatever, because that means nothing outside of this room. You know, these ideas are only useful, there's only pragmatism when they are universalized and there are ramifications to upholding them or not upholding them. So in short, human rights is a term that signifies moral philosophy, for me at any rate, but the right part of it only means something when there's a legal framework to make the moral proclamation binding. We all know, well, maybe we don't know what a legal right is. I'm going to read you out a definition of a legal right here. 1a. A claim recognised and delimited by law for the purpose of securing it. B. The interest in a claim which is recognised by and protected by sanctions of law imposed by a state, which enables one to possess property or to engage in some transaction or course of conduct, or to compel some other person to so engage or to refrain from some course of conduct under certain circumstances, and for the infringement of which claim the state provides a remedy in its courts of justice. 2. The aggregate of the capacities, powers, liberties and privileges by which a claim is secured. 3. A capacity of asserting a legally recognised claim. Compare legal duty. 4. A right cognizable in a common law court as distinguished from a court having jurisdiction in equity. So, after all that, what we get to is what I was saying, that human rights, well, that is a legal right, but you can see that the basis of those legal rights are the human rights that we deem as really important to us, that need to be codified into law to protect the citizens of any given society. So the law works to enable an entity within its jurisdiction the capacity to do or to have or to be something, and without that you have one person or people making moral claims to another person or people, and it's only law that makes these things binding. To mention God, theists often claim morality is only binding. All good, thank you very much. Thank you, Doctor. Cheers. To mention God, theists often claim morality is only binding when objectively embedded within the entity of God. This is patent nonsense and is at very best a promissory note. Secular legal rights that are binding in light of legal organisations such as law enforcement and jurisprudence, as well as prison services and such like, are far more tangible than what is claimed within the theistic notion of binding morality. There are real-world ramifications to not adhering to such rights as laid out in any given legal code. So when we codify human rights into law, they have pragmatic consequences which affect the here and now. I could end up going to prison if I defy those human rights within their legal context. Just saying that God doesn't allow this, unless you get the God Squad or the religious militia enforcing those rules, then it's merely a promissory note. So to form some sort of conclusion, then we need to set out our human rights as a philosophical endeavour, and then write these into law, preferably international and universal law that transcends borders, and then they become these, as I say, universal ideals that affect everyone, no matter where you are from. The reality will be that we arrive at these agreements by consensus, and hopefully that consensus utilizes the tools of logic and reason, observation and data analysis. So we use the tools of, say, science and secularism and philosophy and logic in order to arrive at some decent notions of human rights, knowing that these are merely abstract constructs in our head, and then after that we get together and we codify these into law. We might vote them into law, we might use representational democracy. However it works, we want to use the best form of policy making and law making in order to codify those human rights so that they are effective for everyone in society, no matter who they are, that they don't privilege some and underprivilege others. Anyway, there's my little talk on human rights. They don't exist out there, but they do exist in there, and then we make them exist when we put them into law. Anyway, toodle pips, hope you enjoyed that little chat on human rights. Job done.